Abbiamo avuto il primo di questi due interventi, adesso passiamo a Joël Mokyr. Io ho detto all'inizio che si tratta di personalità diverse, che sono unite nella passione per la storia economica, ma devo aggiungere anche che c'è un'altra passione che li unisce, che è quella per la forza delle idee che sono in grado di cambiare il mondo. Perché anche Joël Mokyr, nella sua attività prestigiosa, ha fatto ricerche, studi, ha scritto libri di grandissimo rilievo per la storia delle idee e non solamente per la storia economica. Lui ha ricevuto nel 2015 il Premio Internazionale Balzan per la storia economica e la motivazione era per il pionieristico collegamento tra scienze economiche e storia, le teorie evolutive e cognitive, nonché lo sviluppo delle conoscenze e della tecnologia, che permettono di gettare un nuovo sguardo comparativo sullo sviluppo economico nel mondo occidentale, in particolar modo sull'industrializzazione, per la molteplicità di contenuti, aspetti e metodi che spaziano dalla chiometria fino alla nuova storia economica, soprattutto all'interpretazione quantitativa e qualitativa dei fenomeni economici, evitando spiegazioni monocausali. Joël Mokyr è nato a Leida, nei Paesi Bassi, ha studiato a Gerusalemme e a Yale, a partire dal 1974 ha insegnato nella Northwestern University, dove è professore di storia, professore di economia e storia. È stato visiting professor in numerosissime università e ha girato il mondo, Stanford, Chicago, Harvard, Dublino, Tel Aviv, Manchester. I primi lavori hanno riguardato la tarda industrializzazione in alcuni paesi come l'Irlanda, i Paesi Bassi, ma soprattutto ha prestato attenzione ai temi della crisi economica, si è distinto come grande esponente dell'economia e della storia, con un'attenzione particolare, come si è detto, all'industrializzazione e alle tecnologie. Il libro che ha scritto sulla creatività tecnologica e il progresso economico è una delle pietre miliari del suo percorso, ma anche il dono che le divinità ci offrono di conoscere le origini storiche dell'economia della conoscenza attraverso un confronto tra la conoscenza proposizionale e quella prescrittiva come condizione di una teoria economica che si interroga sulla produzione o sull'impedimento della conoscenza è stato di grande importanza. Però forse i suoi due lavori più significativi ai fini di questo nostro appuntamento sono quello che lui ha scritto sulla storia economica della Gran Bretagna tra il 1750 e il 1850, in cui ha messo in connessione il fenomeno dell'industrializzazione con quello dell'illuminismo e della rivoluzione francese. E questo è di grande importanza perché lì si è cominciato a fondare la sua teoria istituzionale, guardando soprattutto alle istituzioni britanniche, ma anche al rapporto tra istituzione ed idee. E poi alcuni lavori che hanno riguardato, ad esempio, la cultura della crescita. Ce n'è uno centrale che abbiamo presentato qualche mese fa che riguarda l'origine dell'economia moderna attraverso appunto la cultura della crescita, non solo attraverso le teorie della crescita e dello sviluppo. Mokyr si è distinto oltre che per l'attività editoriale anche per la presidenza dell'Economic History Association e ha contribuito alle basi di una storia economica operante a livello interdisciplinare, guardando in avanti, guardando non solo allo scenario internazionale, non solo alla sua generazione e agli studi della sua generazione, ma guardando verso il futuro e guardando alle tecnologie del futuro, a quelle della quarta rivoluzione industriale con grande attenzione e grande interesse. Insomma, anche qui ci troviamo di fronte a una personalità di assoluto livello internazionale. Io lo saluto, lo ringrazio e chiedo ad Antonio Buonacore di salutarlo anche a nome nostro nella sua lingua.
Professor Mokyr, good evening. I bring with me the greeting of everybody present at the event. You have been presented as a veritable globetrotter of academia and as God's gift to economic history, especially given the breadth and width of your knowledge, the fact that you have been a president of the Economic History Association, and you look at the future, especially concerning the industrialization and the fourth industrial revolution. Maybe the most important works you have produced concerning this event are those on Great Britain's history of industrialization, connected with other historical events, and also your most recent work on the culture of growth as a new beginning, as a new stepstone. So I would like to give you all the heat and a very heartfelt welcome to this event.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now, okay? So there we go, share screen, and
one moment only, the title is Gli incentivi, le istituzioni e l'industrializzazione, un preludio alla crescita economica. Questo è il titolo dell'intervento di Joël Mokyr. Grazie a lui, prego.
Okay, can everybody see this? Can people see this? I'm getting no sound now, but I'm assuming people can see this. Somebody say if the slide is on there.
Okay, I think we can now. I think we can.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so this is the title: Incentives, Institutions, and Industrialization. And I'm very glad and honored to be at this conference, and particularly, of course, honored to follow in the the huge footsteps of my dear friend and colleague from all those years, Deirdre McCloskey. And we agree, as she said, we agree on most things. Where there is some disagreement, perhaps, is on this issue of institutions. And let me just point out, perhaps, just this, and then I'll just get into the talk. I don't disagree that ethics and ideas matter. In fact, I've written about this at great length, ad nauseam, I would say. But I also think, like an economist, that incentives matter, that people respond to incentives. That, in some views, is the entire science of economics while standing on one leg. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So let me go. So Deirdre said it very well. Why are we interested in the Industrial Revolution? Because the Industrial Revolution, in my view, was to economic history what the emergence of monotheism is to the history of religion. It has some roots in the past. And if you look carefully, you find some of its characteristics in earlier on, but it is still what physics call a sort of a phase transition, in the sense that the entire mechanism of economics dynamics was changed until the Industrial Revolution. Most economies were subject to a whole range of negative feedbacks that kept them at a low income. Some of them people say it was Malthusian. Some of them say it was decreasing returns to the growth of trade. There are other stories one can tell. But what it has now become since the Industrial Revolution is an economy of positive feedback in which growth becomes self-sustaining and irreversible. And the reason is that it is no longer based primarily on trade. It is based on knowledge. It is based on technology and on science and on the interaction between the two. And as Deirdre said, and we did not coordinate this, it is the greatest continuity in economic history since the Neolithic Revolution, because for the first time in history, a growing proportion of a rapidly growing population lived at a standard of living far beyond subsistence. And that is the big question. And I'm going to argue, and here Deirdre and I disagree, that institutions did matter. They're not the only thing that mattered, but they did matter. And as I said, this is still contested by some scholars. Deirdre's not the only one. But I'm going to try to convince you that this is still worth looking at. So let me briefly summarize the literature here. Basically, as I see it, is this literature in stressing institution has sort of two strands. One is what you would call general institutions that govern the state and other sort of political organizations. And the other are sort of specific institutions that pertain to something which is sort of uniquely British. So briefly about the general institutions. So this is an approach that's inspired and pioneered by my late dear friend Douglas North, of course, Nobel Prize winner in economics. And basically the argument is that political changes in England in the late 17th, maybe the entire 17th century, in the 18th century, created a political regime that was exceptionally friendly to things like property rights, liberal policies, and economic development. So what it did was it gave political power to a class of people with a commercial orientation. And the government had a friendly attitude to things like entrepreneurship and commerce and money making. And, in the language of political scientists, it created a regime in which there were constraints on the executive, meaning the king is no longer a dictator. And so there is, I would call this, and there is this literature on, 1688 and all was this a landmark event. And let me rephrase this a little bit and put it this way. After 1688, and maybe a little bit before that as well, they solved the problem what I call meta-institutions. So here is what meta-institutions are. If institutions are, as North taught us, the rules by which the economy operates, then the higher level question arises. What are the rules by which society makes the rules? And the answer is these are made by meta-institutions. And that's a big debate in the 18th and 19th century. It leads repeatedly to bloody revolutions, of course, most famously the French revolutions, but elsewhere as well. And Parliament became, and I'm quoting here from the great English legal scholar Blackstone, the place where absolute despotic power, which must in all governments reside somewhere, is entrusted. Now, parliamentary rule, of course, is not a guarantee that is good for economic growth, but I think 18th century development drove it in that direction. And so the spirit of the time, I think, drove parliament in a direction that we can see as progressive. And you can call this culture or beliefs or ideas, but one way or another, this is the age of enlightenment. And I think parliament could not really operate independent of that. And so liberal and enlightened beliefs, as Deirdre already said, led to eventually to the abolition of slavery, the rise of free trade, the disappearance of what they called in England old corruption. They extended the franchise, they emancipated non-Anglicans, they abolished a whole bunch of silly and antiquated mercantilist restrictions and constraints, such as usury laws and prohibitions of emigration and artisans. So, the economy became more free or more liberal. And because of this, the setup of Britain, these changes basically took place without violence and the political turmoil that disrupted life on the continent everywhere. And so by 1770 or so, Britain has a government that supported progress and innovation. And what I call the industrial enlightenment is the age of progress, not just because economic growth was widely felt, because it wasn't really yet in the 18th century, but because of the pervasive belief that economic progress is possible and desirable, which are not the same thing, and that it would be driven primarily by useful knowledge, by science and technology. And I think this matters a lot because innovation has many enemies, and it is resisted everywhere by vested interest, and primarily by workers concerned about their employment and skills, but also other artisans and so on. And so this led, of course, to famous phenomena of resistance called Luddism. And in Britain, I think by and large, the government was not sympathetic to this movement. They supported industrialists with force when needed. Now let me say something about specific institutions which are unique to Britain, and I'm going to talk about two of them, also there are more than that. But the four specific institutions which are largely, if not quite unique to Britain, are the following. One of them is the patent system, which encourages innovation. The other thing is the institutions underlying apprenticeship, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the two other things that I will not have time to talk about, but they may have been important and are also fairly unique to Britain. One is a poor law system, which no other country had. And secondly, the freedom of mobility and internal integration, in the sense that Britain is a reasonably integrated economy in which goods and people can move about freely. So I'm going to talk only about the first two, although I could easily expand that if people want me to. But these things really affected technology most directly. And so deep down, they involve incentives, which is what institutions are supposed to be about. Let me say a few things about patents, okay? So for many scholars in following the work of Doug North, and most recently I can point to the book by Aghion et al. That came out just a month or so ago. And basically what they care about is intellectual property rights, so that you incentivize innovation by giving inventors a temporary monopoly, which you call a patent, and which, I'm quoting here from Aghion's book, created incentives for inventors to innovate by granting them a temporary monopoly, so guaranteeing an innovation right. And the question is, does this, it makes sense, but does it stand the test of facts and data? So here are a few problems with it. The first is that the Netherlands, which really was fairly late to having an industrial revolution, actually had a patent system as well throughout this period, but in fact very few patents were filed. And secondly, if you look at the British patent itself, English patent I should say, it was actually little used before 1750, and it had existed since 1624, but really little used, very little before 1750, and then it suddenly takes off. So as you can see here, until about the Industrial Revolution, in the middle of the 18th century, it's basically flat with a few bumps here and there. And then you can sort of see it take off during the Industrial Revolution. So it seems, at least from a very crude sort of ocular thing, that it's not the patents that are driving the Industrial Revolution, but it's the other way around. It leaves us, of course, with another problem of not explaining it. Now, it's also true that only a small percentage of inventions were ever patented. And then a lot of patents were dead ends and never led anywhere. Now, a few patents I immediately had were smashing successes and made their inventors rich. Of course, the steam engine is famous for that, but you can think about other things such as bleaching powder, patented by a Scotsman called Charles Tennant in 1798, and so on and so forth. And so, it's not that patents were unimportant. It's not, but it's just that a lot of people didn't patent. For one reason, it was expensive. The enforcement was uncertainty, and many judges were hostile. Patents were unpopular because people were, trained that monopolies were bad, but also because many inventors were scientists, and they followed this famous statement by the great French inventor Claude Berthollet, who wrote, he says, when one loves science, he says, one has little need for fortune, which would only risk one's happiness. Well, there are some people who thought like that. Also, economists would probably think they are in the minority. And the fact is that inventors were driven by, if they couldn't be reverse engineered, they were promised ex-ante prizes, especially, of course, the famous Board of Longitude, which promised a big financial prize to somebody in solving the problem. They gave a lot of people who made important inventions ex post rewards and pensions. Then, of course, there's always first mover advantage. Excuse me. First mover advantage, so you're the first one to exploit it, you're going to make the money. And finally, people cared about their reputation, and that's, I think, which is, I think, very important. So people invented for all kind of reasons, and making money surely was one of them, but economists, shouldn't kid ourselves. That's the only thing, being famous, having a reputation was another. Some people were altruistic. They just wanted to do good for humanity. You think about Edward Jenner, smallpox vaccine invention, or Humphrey Davy's, miner's friend, his lamp that wouldn't explode in coal mines. And there may even have been so intrinsic motivation. People just liked inventing. And so Britain had many famous inventors, but so did other countries. And then the question is, why Britain? And here I'm going to come to my second story about institutions, which is really something that I've come to believe in very strongly in the last 5 or 10 years. Now, you needed to have an industrial revolution, you needed more than inventors, right? You needed businessmen, managers, financiers, entrepreneurs. And Britain had these. They were, after all, again, quoting Blackstone, they were a polite and commercial nation. But what really counted here is this mechanics and artisans who not only built the new machines, but installed them and operated them and repaired them when they broke down, which happened all the time. And Britain had far more of those than any other countries. It's important to say that this is knowledge, but it's a very different kind of knowledge. It's tacit knowledge in the sense that it involved learned skills that can't be really codified, and that people can't even fully describe or put in words, let alone teach it formally. So the way these things were taught was through imitation and informal in-person contact. And that, I think, is the key to the creation of mechanical competence. So there is abundant evidence that British artisans in the 18th century were far more skilled and competent and agile and productive than those of other countries. In part, we know this because British engineers and other technical experts were wandering all over the continent, all the way from Russia to Belgium and from Sweden to Italy, installing, repairing, organizing, teaching, consulting, and managing everything. And everybody, writing on both sides of the channel basically said the same thing. British mechanics and engineers were superior, and that gave Britain a significant advantage at the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. So here is a famous quote, which is actually prophetically by a Swiss manufacturer, said, "For a thing to be perfect, it has to be invented in France and worked out in England." And remember, even the steam engine had strong continental roots. The first model was built by a Frenchman called Denis Papin, based on the theories developed by Italian scientists such as Evangelista Torricelli. So, this is clearly not a British monopoly, but they were the ones to build the steam engines and develop them because they had the mechanics who could do it. And so how come? And this is where institutions come back in. The most important institution, I think that here behind this, is how mechanics and engineers are produced themselves, and that is through apprenticeship. And apprenticeship is how society produces skills. And if you think about it, it's a transaction, right, between a master and a young lad whose parents or guardians send him to study with this master. And one of the things that we have found, and this is one paper I've written with co-authors, there's a bunch of other things, is that Britain's system is uniquely flexible and capable of a strong supply response. And the main reason is that elsewhere on the continent, in most places, these apprenticeship contracts are enforced by guilds. And in Britain, that is just not the case. In Britain, they had to solve the problem of how to enforce these contracts. And you think about the contract. It's a difficult contract. It's what we call in economics an incomplete contract. It's a non-repeated game with asymmetrical information in which both sides have many possibilities for opportunistic behavior and shirking. And verifying quality is, of course, very hard, and specifying all contingencies is impossible. Now, in most societies in the world at the time, actually, apprenticeship takes place within the extended family or the clan. But of course, in Europe, clans had long been relegated to a less importance, and it's committed to nuclear families. And so artisans are trained by non-relatives. And this is a contract that is enforced by craft guilds. And craft guilds actually did a reasonable job, but as these guilds are in business to protect their rents and protect the masters, this system becomes increasingly rigid. And so in Britain, we see from the 16th century on, the guilds losing power in doing this. And and other agencies start to intervene. One of them is the state, of course, itself. So the state in 1562 passes this famous law, the Statute of Artificers, which regulated the rules of apprenticeship. Now, there's some debate of whether it was applied strictly or not. I don't think so, but it indicates the importance that they gave in Britain to third-party enforcement of that are not guilds. And so what you see happening in Britain is two things. The first is that contract enforcement relies on local authorities and takes place in what is known as the sort of the shadow of the law. Let's just say the ability of one of the parties to go actually to court, which was very expensive and inflicted high costs on both parties. But both sides have sort of this credible threat of what they call a grim strategy, which is enough to create a self-enforcing equilibrium in which most players could cooperate and bring about a reasonably workable outcome. I say here efficient, I'm not too sure that that's actually true, but certainly workable. And what's more, apprenticeship contracts were supported by reputations in local communities in small towns, which is most of England outside London. People knew one another and they met in pubs and clubs. And if you misbehaved toward his apprentice by not teaching him or beating him up or doing all kinds of things, you took the risk of not being regarded as a gentleman. And this would be very costly, both economically and socially. The same is true of apprentices. If an apprentice misbehaved or was lazy or rebellious, this we would suffer even more costly damage to their reputations. And so the result is that by the, say, 1700, this system in Britain works vastly better than anybody else. And Britain just produces more and better technicians, mechanics, and engineers. And so when the technology begins to change, when people start getting ideas, the industrialists could find the skilled engineers to carry them out. And one reason that, James Watt and Leonardo da Vinci both had lots of good technological ideas, but Leonardo's were never built. And James Watt's was. Why? Because he could get the skilled mechanics and workmen who actually carried out this. And what is striking is that you see the demand for labor going up as the economy advanced, but there is no rise in the skill premium. And that suggests, of course, a successful system that supplies engineers elastically. So in sum then, think about institutions. Are they the driving factor of economic history? And were they exogenous? And so, institutions come from somewhere, and Deirdre is absolutely right, that institutions basically are driven in large part, if not entirely, by culture or belief. Now, other people argue the other way around. Institutions drive culture, not the other way around. So this is a debate worth having, but probably not now. But the main thing that we have to keep in mind here, the underlying ideas of European institutions is this movement of which we call the Enlightenment. And so people, I came up with the term industrial enlightenment, and then we had a medical enlightenment and an agricultural enlightenment, and so on and so forth. But to thrive, I think the Enlightenment needed the right institutional environment. And it is striking that other literate and educated societies such as Islamic world or China did not experience anything like it, And so why is it that European institutions were different enough to generate a movement that produces people who think outside the box, like Spinoza or Diderot or Hume? And of course, this is a long story, but I submit to you that the Enlightenment came out of something that we call a competitive market for ideas. And unlike China or the Islamic world, Europe produced something which I call the 3Ds: dissent, discord, and dispute, which takes place in a fractured and fragmented world where no state had any monopoly power outside its borders. And that, I think, makes for a huge difference. And so the Talmud says, this jealousy of scholars shall multiply wisdom. And so the highly competitive market for ideas in the 16th and 17th century produced a great deal of knowledge and wisdom, and a few of the scientific insight led to technological breakthroughs, although most of that, of course, was to happen after 1780. And so for details, I now have to end, but for details, this is where I would all send you. You can see this is a beautiful cover, and many of the things that I talked about today are there, elaborated in great deal, ad nauseam, you could say. Thank you.